Working now? Yep. Okay, good morning. We begin by thanking our sponsors. Today's daf is Daf Kuf Ches Masechet Zevachim. We begin by thanking Ashi Mindy Schreiber for sponsoring all the shurim as a zechos, all the shurim of the month of Teves as a zechos for a four shleim for Eliyahu, Rafal ben Miriam, Mertz Hashem Yishvizechet Her four shleim. We also thank Mati and Chana Leah Margali for sponsoring all the shurim of the month of Teves in memory of Mati's father, Yosef Shlomo Moshe Shmuel Ben Yekusil Yehuda, whose yard site is on Chavdal Teves, Mr. Shem, Shamash Havan Aliyah, and the family Havan Acham. We also thank Shirley, Avron, Sean, and Judah Elbaum and their families for sponsoring a day of learning today in loving memory of Gerald Elbaum on his yard site. What's the name? Yaakov Koppel Ben Avram Menachem. Mr. Shem, Shamash Havan Aliyah, and the family Havan Acham. We also thank Chaim and Malki Wecker for sponsoring Daf Yomi today to commemorate the yard site of Rita Beyuk Risha Bas Aaron HaKoyin and Mr. Shem. Shama should have an aliyah and the families should have an nechama. Today's daf, as we said, is Daf Kuf Ches. We're beginning on Daf Kuf Zayin Amud Beis, 4 lines before the end of the Gemara says, "Tamaila ve'ebay kazayis." Halach is for a person to be chayiv for ha'ala schutz, for bringing up a carbon outside of the Beis Hamikdash. It has to be a kazayis. What happens, says the Gemara, if a person is ma'ila, he brings it up onto a mizbeach, but ve'ebay kazayis, that amount that he's bringing onto the mizbeach does not have the olive bulk size. However, ve'etzem ashlima lo kazayis, if you'll measure the whole thing together with the etzem, with the bone that's inside it, it will reach the amount of a kazayis. In other words, the halacha is all meat has to go onto the mizbeach, has to be burned on the mizbeach. Bones do not have to go onto the mizbeach. However, we do put them onto the mizbeach together with the rest of the limb. So now in this case, you have meat, which is not a kazayas, but if you'll measure it up together with the bone, the whole thing, the entire piece is going to be the size of a kazayas. So do you count the bone or do you not count the bone? And obviously, the question will be, in our case, if a person brings this piece onto a mizbeach outside of the Beis Hamikdash, is he chayiv for alas chutz, or is he not chayiv for alas chutz? Do we count the bone to help it reach shir kazayis? Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Yochanan says, chayiv, yes, you are chayiv, even though there isn't enough meat for a kazayis, since there's a bone that helps you reach that amount, you are going to be chayiv. Rish Lakish disagrees, and he says, Amar Potter. You're not going to be chayiv because there isn't enough meat to be chayiv. Rabbi Yochanan explains, why do I say that you're chayiv? Because chibure olin ka'olim dami, anything which is connected to part of an ola that goes onto the mizbeach, it is considered to be part of that ola, and therefore, despite the fact that you don't have a chiv, be makriv, the bones, the fact that it's connected, makes it part of the ola. Therefore, if you're going to have a kazayas of bone and meat together, then you will be chayiv for ha'alas chutz on such a piece. Rish Lakish Amar Pater. Rish Lakish disagrees and says you're Pater. Obviously explains the Gemara, and he is of the opinion that chibur olin lav ka'olin dami, something which is connected to something which is supposed to go onto the mizbeach, is not considered part of that ola, not part of that carbon, and therefore, if you're going to be makriv that pachutz, you're not going to be chayiv. Therefore, you have a piece of meat, which itself is not a kazayas. It only reaches the shear of kazayas because of the bone that's connected to it. Says Rish Lakish, the bone does not help you reach that shear. You will be pater for bringing that onto the mizbeach. By Rava. Rava asks the following question. Hamaila, top of Kuf Ches V'Dala. Rosh Ben Yonah. The person brings the head of a Ben Yonah, as we learned before and previously, that when it comes to an Ola Sa'of, you put the head onto the mizbeach. That's why Rashi says, Rosh Yonah shall Ola Sa'of Hello B'chutz. So a person goes ahead and takes the head of a Ola Sa'of on a mizbeach outside the Beis Hamikdash. She'ein bo kizayis. But the head was so small, it did not have the size of an olive. However, Melach Mashlimo L'kizayis. As the pasuk says, Al kol karboncha takrav melech. You must put salt in every single carbon. So here you have a head of an olas oaf, which is not the size of an olive, but you put salt on top of it, and now it does reach that share of a kazayas. Now, what's the halacha? Amarava mi parzakaya. The Rava from Parzakai responds to Rashi and said, Lav hainu pluktau Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Isn't this exactly the same discussion that we just mentioned from Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish? Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish argued if you have something which is not essentially part of the carbon, but it's there, and it's all part of the same piece. We have Machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, whether the additional piece in that case was a bone, in this case will be salt. whether that will help you reach the share of Kazayas. So he suggested that perhaps this is exactly the same machlokes. The Gemara says no, that's incorrect. Rather, the question will still be a good question, both according to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan and according to the opinion of Rish Lakish. Now the Gemara is going to explain. It's still a question according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that the bone could help you finish the share of Kazayas, because ad kan lokam Rabbi Yochanan hasa. Where did Rabbi Yochanan say that the bone could help you reach that shear, that amount of a kazayis, hasam ella etzem demina debasaru. In that case, a bone and meat is still part of the same type. In other words, it's part of the animal, it's part of that same limb. So it's true that if bone does not have a chiv to go onto the mizbeach, the bottom line is it's still part of the limb. So on a limb you have bones, you'll have flesh, you'll have muscles, but it's all part of the same exact limb. So you can understand why he'll say that the bone could ultimately finish up that shear of kazayas. Aval Melech, he could disagree and say, when it comes to salt lav minid debar yonahu, it's not part of this chicken at all. In other words, you have this, not that chicken, this dove, this bird. Not sure why we're thinking chicken over here. You have this little, you're getting close to Shabbos. Lav minid debar yonahu, this head of this yonah, of this dove. Salt is just not part of the head. You could be added on later, but it's not part of the same min. You would say that it's not going to be included. In other words, it's possible for Rabbi Yochanan to say that a bone will help you get to the required share of kazayas for a person to be chayiv, but salt will not, because the bone is part of the actual limb, but salt is not natural to the head of this dove. The Gemara says, Tibayla Rish Lakish will still have a question according to Rish Lakish. In other words, Rish Lakish, who says that the bone will not help you reach that share of kazayas, I could still understand why perhaps salt will get you to that share of kazayas. Why? Because Ad Kalok Rish Lakish, Hasam weird Rish Lakish say that the bone does not help you reach the required share of kazayas for a person to be chayiv. Ella the iparish mine lav mitzvah la suke. If it ultimately becomes disconnected, the meat becomes disconnected from the bone, you do not have a mitzvah to put the bone on the mizbeach. Here, when it comes to the salt on the carbon, the halacha is the salt actually is supposed to go onto the mizbeach. If you put salt on the carbon and the salt comes off of the carbon, you're supposed to scoop up that salt and put it onto the mizbeach. So it's possible that according to Rish Lakish, even though a bone will not help you reach that share of kazayas, because a bone really in it of itself is not supposed to go on the mizbeach. If it becomes disconnected from that limb, you leave it off the mizbeach. Whereas salt, if it becomes disconnected from the carbon, you do put it back onto the mizbeach. So the parish mitzvah lasuke, lo would be different, and there or otum aloshna. Maybe it's not different. So we still have the question according to Rish Lakish, we still have the question according to Rabbi Yochanan, and we do not have an answer to the question of when you have salt that helped the head of this dove reach the shear of kazayas, whether or not that would put the person to a state where he's chayiv for alas chutz. And we'll leave it as a teiko, leave it standing as a question. Back in our Mishnah, we mentioned there was machlokes between Rabbi Yossi HaGlili and the Chachamim. There were two different machlokes, and we're going to address both of them. According to the Chachamim, the person goes ahead and shechts a carbon outside the Beis Hamikdash. So it's shchut echot. Say the Chachamim, that itself is a problem. You then take exactly the same carbon and you put it onto mizbeach outside of the Beis Hamikdash. The halacha is, according to the Chachamim, you've now violated two separate problems of chutz. One shchut echotz, second one ha'alos chutz. lo yerid. Sometimes there are cases where we say kodesh mekablo. In other words, it's not supposed to go onto the mizbeach. In other words, you look at a carbon, you ask a shaila, should we put this on the mizbeach? The halach is no, don't bring it onto the mizbeach. However, if you didn't ask the shaila, or you asked the shaila and you forgot, if it went onto the mizbeach, lo terid. Don't take it down. So says Rabbi Shimon, a carbon that has a disqualification of Yotze, that it was shechted inside and then went outside, that falls into the category of im alu lo terid. If it goes on to the mizbeach, you leave it there. In other words, you're right. Before the fact, lechatchila, don't put it onto the mizbeach. It's not supposed to go onto the mizbeach because it went out of the base of the mikdash. However, if it does go onto the mizbeach, kodesh mekablo, stays on the mizbeach and it's allowed to be there. Whereas something which is shechted outside, if it goes up on the mizbeach, guess what? Get it off the mizbeach. It's not supposed to be there. So therefore, again, another defense of Yossi Haglili would be that if you shecht the carbon outside, this is something which has absolutely nothing to do with the mizbeach. It doesn't belong on any mizbeach. So therefore, if it doesn't belong on any mizbeach, you can't have a chiyuv for putting on a mizbeach bachutz. Whereas the carbon which is shechted inside, that does have some type of connection to mizbeach, because if it went on, you leave it there, and therefore basically you could say that I could understand why, even though it's disqualified once it goes out, I would have a chiyuv for ha'ala bachutz for something which is shechted inside, but not for something which is shechted outside. Now the Gemara says, okay, two different defenses of Yossi Haglili might be now. What's the difference between the two of them? Amar Zeiri says, Shchitas Laila Ike Benayu. Shchitas Laila will be one of these cases where there will be a difference. So as Rashi explains, look at Rashi, Shchitas Laila Ike Benayu, first skinny line. The Rabbi, Shachat Behema Balayla Befnim, if you shech the carbon out inside at night, Behela Bachotz, Potter, Washlei, Heislei, Shasa Kosher, Vishchitas and Nisla. Case like this, if you shecht it at night inside the base of Mikdash, so it never had a shasa kosher. It never met eligibility requirements to go onto the mizbeach because it was shechted at night. However, it was shechted inside, and it would be a case of imalu lo yerid. In other words, this would be a case where you're not supposed to bring it up onto the mizbeach because it never had a shasa kosher. However, it will be a case of imalu lo yerid. That would be a difference between the defense of Rabbi and the defense of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi says another difference would be kibbulo b'klichal ikibenai. If you caught the dam in klichal, so again, shasa kosher, like it says Rashi, it never became kosher. However, kodesh mekablo, it will stay on the mizbeach. Again, another difference between Rabbi and Rabbi Shimon, where according to Rabbi, it never had a shasa kosher because it was disqualified immediately. But according to Rabbi Shimon, still the halach is a kodesh mekablo. It's a lo yerid, and therefore it would be a case where basically would say that there is a chiyuv. Kosher p'sul v'kodesh, kodesh mekabla. Okay. Gemara goes on to the next halach in the Mishnah, which was tamish achal bein kodesh. We learned the Mishnah, that this case came up in the Mishnah kind of just like, by the way, once we brought up this machlokes between Rabbi Yaglili and the Chacham about ha'ala bachutz, there was a similar discussion about tumah. What was that? This is tameh, a person who's tameh, and he eats a carbon. According to the Chachamim in the Mishnah, whether the carbon was tameh or the carbon was tahar, he has violated the tumah, and there's a chiyuv over there. According to Rabbi Yaglili, he says, no, this is only true if the thing that he ate was tahar, because if the thing that he ate was tameh, then what did he eat? He ate something which is davar tameh, so there can't be a chiyuv over there. And again, the Chachamim responded to Rabbi Yaglili and said, Rabbi Yaglili, what you're saying doesn't make any sense. There's never going to be a case where a person who's tameh eats something, and the food that he eats is not tameh. Why? Because the moment he picks it up, it becomes something. We mentioned Tosfos says kasha, that it's possible that you shove it, that someone could have shoved it down his throat by holding it on a stick. But okay, that's a case which is not so shchiach. But ultimately, Rabbi Yaglili did not have any response. Again, it sounded like a very strong claim that Chacham made to Rabbi Yaglili, where they said it's impossible to have a case where a person is tameh and eats something which is tar, and the food is tar when it goes into his mouth. The moment he picks it up, it becomes tameh. So again, the Gemara says, "Shaper ka'ami l'Rabbanan Rabbi Yaglili." Isn't that a very good claim? A very good taina that it's impossible for a person who's tameh to eat something and the food will be tar when it gets into his mouth. Amar Rava kol heicha denitma tumas haguf. You're right. Anytime we're talking about a case where the person was tameh with tumas haguf, the achar kach, and then afterwards nitma basar, then the meat became tameh. Kuli amo lo pligi techayev. Everybody will agree that you're chayiv in that case, just like the Chachamim said. Why? Shekain tumas haguf, the kares, the tumah that the person himself contracts, comes along with the chiv. Kares, ki pligi, where's the machlokes? Bishenitma basar, where the meat was tameh first, the akar kach nitma haguf, and afterwards there was a tumas haguf. And before you go a little further, I'm just going to explain two concepts that are important to understand over here. There are two rules in Shas which we have to connect to this sugi. There's something called ein iser chal al iser, which means that once something becomes aser, it maintains the iser status that it has, and you don't start piling on other isurim. One iser is enough. You're not going to pile on several other isurim. However, there's something else called iser kolel. Iser kolel does not mean that there's an iser to learn in kolel. That's not what it's talking about. Iser kolel means an inclusive Isser over a bunch of different things. So Isser kolel generally would be, trying to think of an example. Let's say something is not kosher. So it includes many different items. Or something is tameh. It includes many different items. And then there's a personal Isser on top of it. It might be Yom Kippur. Or it might be that you're tameh. So Isser kolel is a broad sweeping type of Isser, and Isser chal Isser will be piling one on top of the next. In other words, just to explain Isser kolel again, it will ultimately be, you have an Isser, in our case, there's an Isser of achilas kachim when a person himself is tameh, and then you have those pieces itself have their own individual tumas. Let's see how this works out. Just lost my place in the Gemara. Hold on. Why do Rabbanan say Amrinon Migu? Rabbanan are going to say that since, again, the basar became tameh first, and then he became tameh tumas haguf. So what happened first? First, you had a broad sweeping type of isser, which is all the meat became tameh, and then on top of that, you're adding on his own personal type of chiyuv. I think it's a better example. I mentioned Yom Kippur. A better example would be, let's say you have something which is not kosher, a dairy item which is not kosher, and then you become fleishiks. So now, on top of the fact that the dairy item is not kosher, so that's an Isser kolel, which includes all the dairy which is like that. You have your own personal Isser of the fact that you happen to have eaten fleishiks, and now you can't eat milchiks in the first place. So that will be an Isser nosef, an additional Isser. The Isser chal Isser is just stacking one Isser on top of the next. Isser nosef, which would be on top of an Isser kolel. So you have first a broad sweeping Isser, that this dairy item is not kosher, and then you'll have the personal Isser nosef, which is that you personally happen to be fleishik. I think it's a much better example, much more comparable to this case. So here you have something which is tameh, because all the meat became tameh, and then you have your own personal tumah that you've contracted. So the Gemara says, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, lo amrin migo, we're not going to say that since it's Aser with tumas kolel, you add that on. Rabbi Yossi, hold on. According to Rabbanan, you will say that since it's already Aser, you'll add on the other Isser. But Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Nami, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Savar lo amrin migo. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says we're not going to say this migu. Now the Gemara says, okay, Rabbi Yossi nihid the migu lo amrinon. Okay, I can understand that you're not going to say migu to add on this Isser. The bottom line is that tumas haguf, the individual contracted tumah, should be stronger and should still be able to fall on top of tumas basar. In other words, because it's a stronger isser, it should fall on top of it. Amar Vashi, mimai tumas haguf chamura. Who said? Why are you telling me that tumas haguf is more of a strict tumah? Tumas basar chamura. Maybe the tumah of the basar is going to be more strict. Why she can't in the mikvah? Because there's no way to get rid of it. In other words, a person becomes tameh, he has to go to the mikvah and becomes tar. But once meat becomes tameh, it's finished. You can't just dump the meat into the mikvah and get rid of the tumah. So therefore, maybe that's going to be a stronger type of chiyuv. In other words, that ultimately becomes the machlokes between Rabbi Yossi Glili and the Chachamim. In other words, this concept of Isra Nosef, are you going to say Isra Nosef when it comes to the Tumah? In other words, again, the Gemara ultimately acquiesces and says, when it comes to a case where the person was Tameh first, and then the meat became Tameh, everybody's going to agree in that case. Where is this machlokes? Machlokes is when first the meat became Tameh. So that's a broad spanning Isser Kolel on all the meat, and then he has his own personal Tumah on top of that. The question is, are you going to add that Tumah on or not? According to the Chachamim, you will. According to basically, you won't. And we're not going to say that Tumah Seguf is more Chamar because we don't actually know that it's more strict, because it's possible the Tumah on the meat is going to be more Chamar. On to a brand new Mishnah. Chomer b'shchita. There's something which is more chamor about shchita mi ba'aliyah from bringing it up onto the Mizbeach. Again, we've been talking this whole parak about shchita b'chutz and ha'ala b'chutz. Says the Mishnah there are some stringencies about shchita over aliyah, that's about shechting it over, bringing it up on the Mizbeach, and ubaliyah mi b'shchita, there's certain stringencies about bringing it up onto the Mizbeach over shchita. Chomer b'shchita, what is more strict about shchita? Shashochit lehedyet, a person who shechts for an individual. So he takes a carbon and he shechts it for his next door neighbor. The halach is chayiv. You're still chayiv for shechting kotche b'chutz, even though it wasn't for Hashem. If a person brings it up onto his back for a hedyet, halach is pater. That's not going to be a chiyuv of ha'ala b'chutz. Chomer ba'aliyah, there is a stringency about aliyah, about bringing it up onto his back. Why? What is that? Shnayim she'achsu b'sakin. If two people hold on to a knife, v'shachatu, and they shecht it, peturim, they are pater. In other words, shchita is only with one guy. Two people do it. The halach is they are pater. There's a lot of connections between this sugya and the sugya of Shnaim Shasu in Hilchos Shabbos, but I don't think we have time to discuss that right now. But ultimately, when it comes to shchita, if two people go ahead and shech the karim b'chutz, they're both pater. However, ach zu be'aver, two people grab onto a limb of an animal, and a limb of an animal can be quite heavy and might need two people to carry it on. The halo, and they bring it up onto his back, then chayav. So we have a stringency about shchita, a stringency about ha'ala. The stringency about shchita is, and even if you shecht it for a private person, the lach is yechayev, whereas by ha'ala that's not the case. We have a stringency about ha'ala, which is that if two people do it, they're going to be chayev, whereas two people do shchita, they're going to be pater. Another topic, hela v'chazar v'hela. V'chazar v'hela. So a person brought it up in a bunch of different pieces. Now Rashi points out, hela v'nodalo. In other words, this means he kept forgetting that it was aser. So he brought it, and then he knew, and then he forgot, and he knew, then he forgot. Halacha is, what does the Mishnah say? Chayiv al kol aliyah, every single time he brings up as his own individual. Chayiv, divi Rabbi Shimon. This is the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. The Gemara is going to explain later on today what this case is talking about. Rabbi Yomi disagrees, and he says, Eino chayiv ala achas, you only chayiv once for bringing it up onto his back. In other words, you bring up a bunch of different pieces, and you only chayiv once. Just to point out what I meant, the Gemara is not clear what it's talking about. It's talking about that you brought up a bunch of different pieces of the same carbon, of one animal, one limb. So the Gemara is going to get to that later. Next point, and it has to be they bring it up on top of the mizbeach. Shimon disagrees and he says, Shimon Omer afilu hela al sala al evan. If you bring it up onto a rock or onto some type of stone, a makeshift mizbeach is still going to be chayiv. So again, it sounds like according to Rabbi Shimon, it has to be a formal mizbeach that was built outside the base of the mikdash. That's the only place where there's going to be a chayiv. Shimon disagrees and says, even if you have a DIY job or just a stone or a rock outside, still that's something which you're going to have a chayiv for. Now the Gemara begins. Maishna hamala. Why is it when a person brings a carbon onto a mizbeach for a private person that he's pater? The chsiv Lashem, the pasuk says Lashem, as we mentioned about Pesach Ol Moed, Lo Yivienu Lasos Oso Lashem. It says the Gemara B'Shchita Nami about Lashem. When it comes to Shchita, it also says Lashem. It says Pesach Ol Moed, Lo Hevio La'akriv Carbon LaHashem. Where it says Shani Yosef Dabakra. Ish, ish. When it came to the pasuk of shchita, over there it says ish, ish. And since it says ish, ish, which is the pasuk says very clearly, ish, ish, mi beis Yisrael sheyishchat Shar Oikesav Oyesh B'machna O it says ish there, and therefore it sounds like this is something which is relevant even for a private individual. Now the Gemara says, hold on. Gabi Allah namiksiv ish ish. When it comes to Allah, it says exactly ish. It's a repetition of the word ish. It says Valem Tomar. Mentioned this pasuk yesterday. It says ish mi basis shom min ager asher yorgam zochem asher yala ola zavach. So it says la shem in both cases. It says ish in both cases. Well, the Gemara says the problem is when it comes to the Allah to bring it up on the mizbeach mi boile l'shnayim shehelu be'ever chayavin. Over there, when it came to bring it up onto the mizbeach, we used ish to tell you that two people who do it together that they will be chayav. The Gemara says, hold on. In Kena Chanami. Say exactly the same thing. Why are you saying ish tells you two people who carry a liman to the mizbeach? They're going to be chayev because it says ish. But when it comes to shkita, you don't say that. It also says ish there. It also says ish there. Where it says shani hasum d'amakra hahu. It says in that pasuk hahu. It says very clearly lo ish hahu to that individual person. Echad v'loshnayim. So there's the stipulation of hahu. Yahaki says the Gemara gabi olanami ksiv hahu. It says hahu by Allah as well. Remember it says v'pesach ol moed lo yivien lasos oso lashem v'nichos ha'ish hahu. That individual mi'amav. Where it says no, that we need already. Mibayle limeute shogeg onis umuta. That hahu comes to exclude a person who is a shogeg, an anos, or a mutta. What are these three things? So shogeg is simply a person who does not know. He made a mistake. He thought it was he thought that what he was doing was okay. An anos, so it's not exactly clear what an anos means. Typically, an anos means a person who was forced against his will. He had no ability to control it. However, Tosfos understands it can't be. You're going to have a special pasuk to exclude an onus. An onus is always going to be excluded. So therefore, Tosfos says, "B'shema hay onus prat le'omer mutter." This is a little bit different than a shogeg. This is a person who he knows it's mutter. He's one of those guys who knows. He knows it's mutter, except he's wrong. In other words, he knows he's a person who says, no, this is mutter. What I'm doing is going to be perfectly mutter. So shogeg is a person, he doesn't know the halacha. He made a mistake. And omer mutter is a person, he actually thinks that this is a case that's going to be permissible. So it's slightly different. Umutter is a person who is tricked. The person told him that it was mutter, but it's not. In other words, three different versions of a shogeg. Ihachi, if that's the case, hachanami. Again, it's always going to go both ways. If you're telling me in one case you're going to use the word hahu to exclude a person who did it by mistake, so then it would be relevant in the other case as well. Where it says trei hahu ksivi. It says hahu twice. El Lashem lam. At least what do you have to have Lashem for? Lahoti sar mishtaleach. Lashem where it excludes sar mishtaleach, that there is no chiyuv for a person who shechts the sar mishtaleach outside the Beis Mikdash. Again, what's the sar mishtaleach? You mentioned a number of times. Sar mishtaleach is that goat that on Yom Kippur which is pushed off the cliff. The person shechts the sar mishtaleach outside, that's going to be disqualified. No chiyuv of shkutei chutz or ha'ala b'chutz, because it's not supposed to be brought up onto the mizbeach in the first place. So since it's not supposed to go onto the mizbeach, there's no chiyuv for bringing it up onto the mizbeach outside because it doesn't belong on the mizbeach. It's supposed to be shoved up of a cliff. And the Gemara said, Chomer ba'Allah, there is a stringency when it comes to bringing it up onto the mizbeach. What is that? Tan Rabbanan. Ish. So what was the stringency when it came to Allah? We said the stringency was about two people carrying it up. When it comes to shchita, two people shecht are going to be pater. When it comes to carrying it up onto the mizbeach, if two people do it, they will be chayav. So Tana Rabbanan. Ish. The pasuk tells us ish, as we just got mentioned, as we just mentioned before. It says ish. Clearly talking about a person who's bringing a carbon onto the mizbeach. Ma talmud lomar l'rabos. Why does it say ish twice? L'rabos shnayim she'achzu be'ever v'helu. Comes to include two people who are holding onto a limb and bring it up onto the mizbeach shechayavin, that they will be chayiv. Why do you have to have a pasuk to tell you that? Sheyachal, I would have thought, Valotinu, I could use my own logic to make a kavachom over here. I'll say as follows: Umaha shochit lehedyit. When I come to look at a case of a person who shechts an animal for a private person, shechayev, he's chayev, he shechts for a private person, shnaim she'achzu b'sakin, v'shachtu peturin. But the halacha is, if two people shecht, they will be patur. So again, it seems like when it comes to chita, there's a stringency about person who shechts for a private person, and still he's going to be patur if two people do it. I would say hamal lahedya, a person who brings a carbon up to an hedya, he's going to be patur. So I would say that there's a leniency when it comes to ha'ala, and din shishnaim shachsu peturin. I would say it follows, logic would dictate that two people who bring it up, they're going to be patur as well. Tamalomar. So therefore the pasuk comes to say, ish, to say no, that two people who bring up a carbon onto the mizbech outside, they'll both be chayiv. Divi Rabbi Shimon, these are the words of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yossi Omer basically disagrees and says, hahu. The pasuk says hahu, and therefore darshan echad v'lo shnaim, only one person but not two. So now the Gemara says, okay, according to Rabbi Yossi, you're telling me that the word hahu tells you that only one person is chayiv and not two. Okay, matal number ishish. So why do you have to confuse me in the first place and say ishish? So he responds and says, don't get all hung up on that. Dibra Torah klosham b'nei adam. The Torah sometimes just speaks the way human beings speak. Sometimes when people speak, they say extra things for just to bring out the point. They'll reiterate. Just that's the way people talk. People speak that way sometimes. Sometimes it's to make a point. Sometimes it's because the person just likes to speak in flowery language. But sometimes people double the language. Says Rabbi Yossi, the Torah does that as well. Rabbi Shimon, hi haho, according to Rabbi Shimon, hi haho, mibayale lemute shogeg onus umuta. So again, it does say hahu. So what does he do with the fact that it says hahu? Gemara answers that he uses that to exclude a person who did it by mistake. Rabbi Yossi, mehu hahu. He does learn that from that word, but he learns that from the ha in the word hahu. So they both can use the word hahu to exclude a person who does it by mistake. The question is it from the word hahu entirely or the hey? Rav Shimon, hu hahu lo dar. She does not dash an extra hey in the word. So it's interesting. According to Rabbi Yossi, the double lashon of ish is not impressive. Sometimes the Torah, dibra Torah klosham b'nei adam, but the extra hey he does darshan. According to Reb Shimon, the extra hey he does darshan. No, according to Reb Shimon, the extra hey he does not darshan, but ish he does darshan. Now the Gemara asks, Rabbi Yossi, midahai ish. When it comes to ish, when it comes to the ha'ala over here, dibra Torah klosham b'nei adam. Now, hahu ish, namri dibra Torah klosham b'nei adam. If you remember just a few minutes ago, at the bottom of Daf Kuf Chesam and Aleph, we asked the question, Ma'ishna hamal lahedit tepat l'ksiv l'Hashem shchita nami ksiv l'Hashem shani hasan avakra ish. Everyone's darshaning ish that a person will be chayav for shchita for a private person. So he darshaned it over there. Why is he darshaning over there? The Gemara says, again, just to read it inside again. Midahai ish dibra Torah klosham b'nei adam. Hahu ish nami dibra Torah klosham b'nei adam. So how do you know that you shchita for a private person is going to be chayav? The Gemara asked that question. The chayiv, the Gemara says, nafkali midam yechashev lo ish hahu. It says lo ish hahu, dam shafach v'afil hashochet lo ish. So since it says lo ish hahu to that person, so therefore it sounds like it's for an individual person, and therefore shchita for a private person is going to be a chiyuv even outside, not necessarily because of ish, but rather because it says ish hahu to that person, which sounds like even if it's shechted for a private person, you'll be chayiv. So again, everything's consistent. He does not darshan ish ever. He says the Torah sometimes speaks like people, and for emphasis, people sometimes go ahead and reiterates things, so the Torah does the same thing as well. It's not a separate drasha to learn from there. So where does he know that shechting for a private person will be chayiv? From the word le'ishahu. Next, we mentioned in the Mishnah, hela v'chazar v'hela. If you bring it up once, and bring it up again. What's this talking about? Amar Rish Lakish. Machlokes in the Mishnah is bedalid v'hei evarim. We're talking about 4 or 5 different evarim. Demar Savar, one opinion is the kiksiv lasos oso. The pasuk says lasos oso al hashalem hu chayiv. Is chayiv on the entire thing. Ve'eno chayiv al chasar. You're not chayiv on something which is missing, which means akol behemaksiv. That was referring to the entire animal. And therefore, it's referring to the whole animal, and therefore you won't be chayiv on each individual limb. Umar savar akol aver v'aver ksev, it's referring to each individual limb, and therefore for each limb that you'll bring up, you will be chayiv. Aval aver echad divrei akol, however, on one aver, he says, divrei akol eno chayiv el achas. In other words, you have one aver which is sliced up into a bunch of pieces. Everybody agrees if you take it up in 5 or 6 different steps, you're not going to have individual chiyuv on each individual piece. So again, according to Reish Lakish, if you have one limb cut up into a bunch of pieces, everybody agrees only one chiyuv over there. The only question is, if you're bringing up a bunch of different avarim shleimim, is there a chiyuv on each individual limb, or is it only a chiyuv on the whole animal? Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. He says, no, machlokes be'aver echad. The machlokes in the Mishnah is by one individual limb. Demar savar muktare pnim. If you have something which is brought up inside the Beis Hamikdash, shechasru, it lost something. Vehelu b'chutz, you brought it up outside. Chayiv, you're going to be chayiv. What's the case talking about? It's talking about it went onto the mizbeach and it popped off the mizbeach. We mentioned this before because of the heat, so it got burnt a little bit. So one opinion is, Muktari Pnim Shechasru V'Hela Bachutz, you're going to be chayiv. Why would that be? Because inside the Beis Hamikdash, we learned you're supposed to put it back on. So it's called poking. We'll get to this in a minute. But you have something which flies off from his back from the intense heat. Even though it's missing part of the limb, you put it back on. So what that essentially means is, even though it's chaser, but since inside it's going to go back on, outside you have a chiyuv for it. Umar Savar, the other opinion is, Potter, you're going to be chayiv. Now, Aval Badal V'He'evarim, we're talking about several different limbs. Divrei Akol Chayiv, everyone will agree that you're going to be chayiv. So again, the opposite. According to Rabbi Yochanan, they'll agree when it's different limbs. Everyone agrees you're going to be chayiv. Chayiv Akol Ever V'Ever. Upliga de Ula. This ultimately disagrees with Ula. Why? The Amar Ula. Hakal Modim. Everyone agrees with Muktari Pnim. And when it comes to things which are processed or burned and shechted inside the Beis Hamikdash, shechasru v'helu b'chutz. That if it came off the mizbeach and it's missing something, v'helu b'chutz, you brought it up on the mizbeach outside shechayiv, that you will be chayiv. Lo nechleku el muktari chutz. The only machlokus is when you're talking about something which was burned outside, shechasru, it's missing, v'helu b'chutz, you brought it up outside, the marsav v'pater marsav chayiv. There's where the machlokus is going to be whether you're chayiv or not. In other words, ikut amri, some learned ula slightly differently, which is the lishon of Basra. Amar Ula kol modim b'muktari chutz. Everyone agrees with when it comes to something which is processed and burned outside. Shechasru v'hela b'chutz, where it's missing a part and you brought it up outside. Shehu potter. Everyone agrees you're potter. Lo nechleku. Weird. Is there a machlokes in our Mishnah? Ela b'muktari pnim. It's only when we're talking about something which is burned in shechasru v'hela b'chutz that was missing, and you brought it up outside the marsav or potter. One would say you be potter marsav or chayiv. Upliga davu. The Shmuel ultimately. You have to keep your head together for all this. This disagrees with the opinion of Avur de Shmuel. Al Lishna Kama, Avur de Shmuel is going to argue on the Lishna Kama of Ula. The Ula, why? How do you know that? It says very clearly, Avur de Shmuel, Keman Madrinan Pokin, according to who do we return burnt items that flew off the Mizbech? When the God Mizbech command the Lokar Bisi, it's not according to Bisi. So clearly, that argues with the Lishna Kama in Ula, where he said there was no machlokes over there. Again, machlokes exactly where we have machlokes in our Mishnah. Several layers to machlokes. You have the machlokes in the Mishnah and the machlokes in the Gemara. Two Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, and then two different versions of Ula. Let's just go a little bit further. You're not going to be chayiv until you bring it up on top of the mizbeach. The last thing we learned in our Mishnah was a machlokes whether it has to be a real mizbeach or a makeshift mizbeach like a stone or any other elevated surface is going to be good. Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna says, "My time at Rabbi Yossi." What's the reason why Rabbi Yossi says that it has to be a mizbeach? What does it say? Noach, get out of the teva. And he built a mizbeach Hashem. There was no Beis Hamikdash then. What did he do? He built a mizbeach. So clearly you see it has to be a mizbeach. On Rabbi Yochanan, my time to what's the reason why Rabbi Shimon disagrees? He says, well, I went a little further. I learned some nach. The Chsiv, it says in the pasuk, "Vayikach manoach eskedi ha'izim v'samincha v'yal al hatzor." After he had this revelation from the Malach that his wife is going to have a baby who's going to be Shimshon. He was so excited about that, and he went ahead and he brought a carbon to Hashem. Where? Vayal alatzor, on a rock. So you see clearly we're talking about a time when there's no Beis HaMikdash, and you're bringing a carbon outside. A bama could be just a rock. Alatzor LaHashem. So then the Gemara says, hold on. V'idach nami v'chsiv v'ivim mizbeach LaHashem. So how do you deal with the fact that it says that it was mizbeach? The Noach built a mizbeach. Gemara said, nah, ha'u gova ba'alma. That mizbeach didn't actually mean mizbeach looking like mizbeach inside the Beis HaMikdash. It was just some type of elevated surface. V'idach nami v'chsiv v'ikach manoach. How are we going to deal with the fact that according to Rabbi Yossi, the pasuk says Yikach Manach, and he put it on a rock? The Gemara says Harasha. That was just a one-time case where there was a ruling that you're allowed to bring it up on a rock. Alternatively, you can say Hani Tari de B'Shimon. This is the reason for B'Shimon the Tanya. B'Shimon Omer. B'Shimon says Mizbeach Pesach Olamoy. The exact wording of the pasuk is V'zarak hakohen sadam al mizbach Hashem Pesach Ol Hamoed. So it says mizbach and then Pesach Ol Hamoed. In other words, v'ein mizbach b'bama. Mizbach only needs to be inside the Ol Hamoed, but not on a bama, not in a private area. Lefikach, therefore, hela ala sela or ala even chayiv will be chayiv. Because again, mizbach, the requirement of mizbach is only relevant inside the Beis HaMikdash, not outside. And the Gemara says chayiv. Why are you saying chayiv? Yotza mi boile. It should say yotza. Hello, Sali. He's yotze. Gemara says hachi kam. This is what it means to say lefikach b'shas isra bamos. Therefore, at a time when it's also to have a private mizbeach, hella al sela, if you can bring it up on top of a rock, al even you're going to be chayiv. Why? Because that is considered to be a good enough mizbeach when you're not inside the Beis HaMikdash. Therefore, if it's b'shas heter bamos, you'll be Yotzei. If it's b'shas Isra Bamos, you're going to be chayiv. A couple more lines. Rabbi Yosef Chanina, Keren v'kevesh v'yesod v'ribua maush ya'akvu b'bama. According to the one who says you have to have mizbeach, do you have to have all the qualifications of mizbeach? Do you have to have the horns on the top? Does it have to have a ramp? Does it have to have the base on the bottom? Does it have to have ribua? Does it have to be perfectly square? Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Tani, we learned in the Brisa, Keren v'kevesh v'ribua v'yesod ma'akiv v'bama gedola. They're ma'akiv and bama gedola, like in Nov and Givon. However, v'ein ma'akiv bama getana, they're not relevant to private mizbechas that any other person might build in their backyard. And therefore, the answer is, yes, it's ma'akiv by bama gedola in Nov and Givon, but in other places, and certainly Shiloh, Beis Olam, Rashi says, but a private mizbech does not have to have all those qualifications. Baruch Hashem, able to finish at a Mishnah. Mirz Hashem, I think we'll still be back tomorrow. It's a tremendous covet to be able to learn with everybody. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful